Hey guys, SuperHorrorBro Mike here, and in today's Bendy and the Ink Machine video, we take a look at the mysterious new Boris who shows up at the end of Chapter 4 with a theory about who exactly he may be. But before we jump into today's video guys, remember to subscribe and hit that bell to be notified every time a new video drops. Previously I had put together a massive in-depth theory and analysis video which broke down the ending of Bendy Chapter 4, examining both versions of Alice Angel, their motives, and the characters who may have portrayed them, coming to the conclusion that Susie Campbell was bad Alice and Alison Pendle was good Alice, and that the Boris who showed up beside good Alice was likely handyman Wally Franks. I came to this conclusion based on the fact that not only had Wally featured heavily throughout audio logs in previous chapters, but the Boris clone in Chapter 3 had also exhibited many of Wally's character traits, leading me to believe this new Boris was the real Wally Franks. After all, he would have had knowledge of the ins and outs of both the studio and the ink machine itself, as well as general repair expertise. It's quite a coincidence this new Boris has a mechanical arm, presumably taken from the Bendy robot found within the research and development wing of Level S. Wally would likely have known how to fit such an arm, especially as he maintained machines and contraptions around the studio, probably assisting with the construction and upkeep of these robots as well. Wouldn't Wally Franks be the perfect worker to fit the description of this new Boris, as well as being the perfect ally to Henry and Alice, using all that insider knowledge of the ink machine and the studio layout to stop the ritual once and for all? Well, yes, and this theory seemed pretty solid. However, a proverbial wrench was thrown into the works. While working hard on my initial theory, it was discovered, unbeknownst to me, that this new Alice was indeed called Alison, and the new Boris was called Tom. Certain fans managed to extract these new character names from the Chapter 4 game files, so it seems my theory about the two Alices was indeed correct. But my theory about Boris being Wally Franks was incorrect, at least in part. More on that later. This new Boris is known instead as Tom, so which character does this now line up with? Why, Thomas Connor, of course. This is interesting, as Thomas Connor was also a handyman, helping to maintain the upkeep of the studio, just like Wally Franks. In fact, it seems Thomas may have been Wally's superior.
Alright, let's go over this again. If the pressure goes over 45, I screw the safety bolt in tighter, right?
No, for the last time you do that, you blow every pipe in this place.
Judging by this recording, it sounds as though Wally was pretty lazy and didn't exactly shine in his job role as fellow handyman at the studio, whereas Thomas Connor was actually decent at his job, to the point where he seemed to be in charge of Wally himself. An interesting point here is that unlike Wally, who seems happy-go-lucky, Thomas sounds far more stern and serious throughout all of his audio logs.
Whoever thought that these rummy pipes could hold up under this kind of strain? Either knows something about pressure I don't, or he's some kind of idiot.
These people gotta lighten up.
When looking at this new model of Boris, we can tell he seems to share Thomas Connor's mannerisms. His facial expression is both serious and stern, and the way he gestures with that pipe shows he means business. These should have been red flags in my original theory. The mannerisms of new Boris do indeed favour what we know about Thomas Connor far more than Wally Franks. So let's take a look a little deeper and explore everything we know about Thomas Connor. We know he was also a handyman at the studios.
You can bet I won't be doing any more repair jobs for Mr. Joey Drew.
And we know he was likely in a position of authority over Wally, the studio's other handyman.
You know, this sounds harder than comparing earwax to beeswax.
Look, it's not that difficult. Just keep an eye on the gauge.
We also know Thomas Connor was very serious, and this fed into how he conducted himself at work. He seems to be a cautious character as well, not taking any chances when it comes to keeping himself free of danger.
If Mr. Joey Drew keeps cutting corners like this, someone's sure to end up falling to their death. And it sure ain't gonna
We know Thomas Connor and Joey Drew did not see eye to eye, as Connor states the studio seems to be both dangerous, poorly maintained, and full of problems.
It's dark and it's cold, and it's stuck in behind every single wall. In some places, I swear this godforsaken ink is clear up to my knees.
It sounds like Joey was pouring all of his money, time, and attention into his grand master plan, the ink machine and future ritual that we now know has turned the workers of the studio into cartoon creations and inky abominations. It was likely Thomas Connor knew about this in part, as like Wally, he would have been working on maintenance jobs all over the studio. However, it seems unlikely he knew the true motives and intentions behind these strange and mysterious machine designs. Joey would not have shared his reasons for building such machines with workers such as Thomas and Wally. It seems Thomas Connor was not happy with the way things were going at the studio, but then somehow became a victim of the machine himself, transforming into a version of Boris the Wolf. He seems to have sustained an injury too, as he sports a mechanical arm. Maybe he tangled with the ink demon firsthand and lived to tell the tale. He does seem like quite a tough guy, after all. Okay, so if we have established this new version of Boris is Thomas Connor, where does that leave our original theory that Wally Franks was indeed a version of Boris himself? Well, I think this theory is actually pretty safe. In fact, it's only been reinforced by the revelation that the new Boris is Thomas Connor, both characters being handymen at the studio. In my previous theory, I explained that the Boris Henry encounters in Bendy Chapter 3 seems to share many of the mannerisms and character traits of fan favourite Wally Franks. From his scared demeanour, to his ability to help out Henry with a number of handyman related jobs, to the fact that he made a collage which pretty much screams, "Help, I'm trapped in the body of Boris," found within the very safe house he inhabited, and we even see a little of Wally's trickster personality thrown in for good measure.
Boris? Oh, you scare me to death.
Everything pointed to the Boris in Chapter 3 indeed being Wally Franks. This Boris does indeed die at the end of Chapter 4. We can tell this by giving him the bone during Chapter 3, which then carries over to the Boris who attacks Henry during the finale of Chapter 4. So that would mean Henry met Wally in Chapter 3 as the first version of Boris, and then after being snatched away by Alice, was forced to take Wally down at the end of Chapter 4. Thomas Connor then showing up as the second version of Boris shortly after. So is this the final theory we should go with here? Maybe, but there is an alternative I'd like to present. The theory I mentioned assumes that Wally and Thomas were the only two repairmen who worked for Joey Drew Studios. But this was a massive place with a lot of machinery that would need constant maintenance. So it is likely they had an entire team of workers doing similar jobs, perhaps all working under the direction of Thomas Connor. This explains the reason we see so many Boris clones. If the repairmen Wally Franks and Thomas Connor both became versions of Boris, perhaps the ritual caused all the other workers with similar job roles to also become a version of this beloved cartoon character. Explaining why there are so many versions of Boris throughout the studio, and also why Henry discovers the wrench on Boris in Chapter 1. If this theory is correct, it means that the key items we collected in Chapter 1 didn't belong to any one character, but rather represented the job roles of a group of workers. The ink, for example, representing the artists, the record, the musicians, the wrench, the repairmen, and so the ritual turned both Alice Angel actresses into Alice Angel. The ink turned artists into searchers and ink people, and the wrench turned the handymen into versions of Boris. If this theory is correct, it flips everything on its head. We'll have to wait until Chapter 5 to find out for sure, but this may mean the Boris from Chapter 3 was a generic worker and not actually Wally Franks at all. Rather, it may have been another repairman with a similar personality. And that's it for today's video, guys. I hope you did enjoy it. Remember to go and check out my Bendy Chapter 4 ending explained theory, as that's very in-depth about why both versions of Alice are Susie Campbell and Alison Pendle, as well as explaining a bit more about the whole Boris theory as well. I wanted to do this as a follow-up video, guys, and while doing this theory I did discover something very interesting about the ritual that you just heard explained. Remember, if you have enjoyed this video, guys, to give it a like, leave me a little comment down below, and of course subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this one, and I will see you guys on the next video.